At a recent Foreign Ministry press briefing, a senior spokesman laid out a sweeping account of Beijing's diplomatic priorities, a mix of outreach to Latin America and the Caribbean, stern warnings about regional security and sovereignty, and a sharp rebuke of political moves in Tokyo and Taipei that Beijing says threaten stability in East Asia. What follows is a clear, measured narration of those remarks, with verbatim passages preserved where the spokesman's words cut to the heart of China's position. The briefing opened on the question of China's engagement with Latin America and the Caribbean, often shortened in Beijing to LACI, and framed that relationship as a multi-layered partnership built around 5 strategic programs. The spokesman said their objective is to build a community with a shared future and to deliver tangible benefits for both peoples. He described progress under 5 named pillars: solidarity, development, civilization, peace, and people-to-people connectivity. On the solidarity front, the spokesman emphasized increased political trust and high-level exchanges. He noted that President Xi Jinping conveyed a congratulatory message to the 10th summit of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, a move Beijing described as warmly received. The spokesman said these exchanges have produced mutual support and encouraged what he called positive responses from LACI countries on issues of global governance, including participation in international mediation efforts. Development cooperation, he continued, has taken concrete form through infrastructure and trade. Beijing highlighted the signing of cooperation documents under the Belt and Road Initiative with Colombia and cooperation plans with Grenada and Ecuador. Trade, he said, has reached record levels, and China has hosted broad participation from the region at trade events. On financing, the spokesman reiterated an earlier pledge, saying China has made more progress than expected, and in extending the pledged 66 billion yuan credit line to LAC's partners. That figure he framed as a practical demonstration of Beijing's willingness to underwrite development projects across the hemisphere. Cultural and academic ties, the spokesman argued, are also deepening. Under the Civilization program, he pointed to a range of forums, from think tank gatherings to cultural roadshows, art troupes and film festivals, which, he said, have sparked widespread interest and fascination across LAC societies. These exchanges, Beijing suggested, are intended to foster mutual understanding and reshape narratives about each other's histories and societies. On peace and security, the tone stiffened. The spokesman reaffirmed China's support for the LAC region's status as a zone of peace and reiterated opposition to what he called violation of purposes and principles of the UN Charter. He recalled a joint statement with Brazil on the Ukraine crisis and cited regional backing for a 5-point initiative aimed at restoring stability in the Gulf and the wider Middle East, language intended to underscore Beijing's claim to be a constructive actor in global security issues. The final pillar, people-to-people connectivity, produced some attention-grabbing practical claims. The spokesman said China has extended a trial visa-free policy to Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay, and that passenger air links had increased to 24 flights per week. He celebrated the opening of a direct China-Argentina route as setting a record for one of the world's longest passenger flights, and noted humanitarian outreach by Chinese medical teams, including a hospital ship providing services to local communities. He closed the segment on Lake C with an unmistakable pledge: no matter how the international landscape may evolve, China will remain a good friend and good partner of LAC countries and bring more benefits to people in China and LAC countries. Those words came as both reassurance to partners and a public declaration of Beijing's long-term strategic interest in the Western Hemisphere. Reporters then steered the briefing toward other flashpoints in Asia. One line of questioning focused on Japan responding to a domestic political drive in Tokyo to revise Japan's post-war constitution. The spokesman framed the issue through the lens of history. History is a mirror, he said, invoking the memory of Japan's early 20th century slide into militarism and the suffering it brought. He argued that Japan's post-war commitment to renounce war had been a fundamental prerequisite for Japan to be readmitted to the international community and had shaped the country's pacifist identity for generations. The spokesman was pointed in his criticism of the administration in Tokyo. He described moves to abandon pacifism and rearm as being led by right-wing forces that, in his words, were gambling with the livelihoods of the Japanese people and jeopardizing peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific. He warned that reinterpreting or revising the Constitution, and in particular Article 9, the clause that renounces war, risked tearing up the pacifist identity cherished by generations in Japan. Given the scale of public reaction, he cited the protests sweeping Japanese cities as evidence of broad popular unease, saying the demonstrations showed that people across Japan are increasingly aware that to embark on the road of militarism is a doomed path. He concluded with a call: all peace-loving nations and Japanese people should reject the remilitarization scheme of Japan's right-wing forces and stem the rise of Japan's new militarism. To anchor that critique in contemporary politics, the spokesman referenced Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi by name, responding to a question about her administration's push for constitutional revision. The Beijing spokesman painted the effort not only as a domestic political project in Tokyo, but as one with regional security implications, arguing that any change loosening restraints on the use of force would be destabilizing for Asia more generally. Another exchange turned to cross Taiwan Strait relations after an address by Taiwan's president to an international democracy forum in Copenhagen. The spokesman dismissed the forum as ideologically biased and sharply criticized Taiwan's leadership for what he described as pro-independence rhetoric. He said bluntly, "Taiwan is a part of China. It has never been a country and will never be a country." The One China principle is an international consensus that has solid support and is simply unshakable. He accused Taiwanese separatists of spreading false narratives and of attempting to sow discord between the two sides of the strait, characterizing their actions as reckless and provocative. Throughout the briefing, the spokesman repeatedly placed Beijing's positions in contrast to what he called the disruptive practices of outside actors he identified as enabling separatism or remilitarization. On the U.S.-China relationship, his comments were terse and deferential to diplomatic channels. When asked about bilateral talks, he directed reporters to the competent authorities and reiterated that a forthcoming state visit by a high-profile state visit by a high-level exchanges on major issues concerning China-U.S. relations and world peace and development. In his words, those meetings would be conducted in the spirit of respect, equality, and mutual benefit, aimed at delivering more stability and certainty to the world. That line was delivered as a short, formal note of intent, an attempt to frame rivalry as manageable through elite diplomacy. The briefing touched, too, on a string of other international issues China tracks closely. On Cuba and Venezuela, the spokesman insisted that China's positions are consistent and clear and has no change, signaling Beijing's continued diplomatic posture toward long-standing partners in the Western Hemisphere. On global hotspots, he argued that China's priorities include adherence to international law and the United Nations Charter, and he framed Beijing's calls for negotiated settlements as part of its broader pitch as a stabilizing power. What emerges from the full set of remarks is a pattern. Beijing wants to show it is both engaged economically and firm politically. Economically, it stresses trade, infrastructure finance, and cultural outreach as the glue that binds China to a wide and growing list of partner states. Politically, it is quick to counter what it sees as threats to its core interests, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the political status quo in its neighborhood. Two elements stand out as emblematic of that dual approach. First, the financial and connectivity pledges to Latin America and the Caribbean are presented not as transactional deals, but as a strategic package, a combination of loans, trade engagements, PO, plea to people links and cultural diplomacy intended to further integrate Lac Lake into an economic orbit in which China plays an indispensable role. The spokesman's detailed list, from credit lines to airline routes and cultural festivals, was meant to signal depth and normalcy in those ties. Second, Beijing's responses to political developments in Japan and Taiwan serve as reminders of the limits China places on acceptable behavior from its neighbors. In Tokyo, the message is that any move perceived as normalization of military force will be resisted rhetorically and made the subject of diplomatic pressure. In Taipei, the message is even more uncompromising. Assertions of sovereign status beyond the Chinese framework are dismissed as illegitimate and destabilizing. For international audiences, the spokesman's public posture is both an offer and a warning. His invitations to cooperate on trade and development are sincere in their own terms. China's financial commitments and cultural outreach are real levers of influence. But alongside those offers, the spokesman insisted on red lines that China will police vigorously, and he did so with language meant to be heard both in capitals and on the streets. In a region where strategic competition is intensifying and domestic politics remain volatile, that mix of generosity and firmness is likely to shape Beijing's relationships for the months ahead. Whether partners in Latin America and the Caribbean view China primarily as an economic lifeline or as a geopolitical suitor will depend on how Beijing translates credit lines and cultural programs into long-term partnerships, and on how other major powers respond to China's diplomatic script. Similarly, in East Asia, the stakes are high. Moves to revise constitutions or to push the boundaries of sovereignty are not purely domestic matters in a region where memories of past conflict and unresolved territorial disputes endure. Beijing's spokesman framed his country's objections as rooted in history and stability. For Tokyo and Taipei, the challenge will be to navigate domestic political dynamics while managing fraught neighborhood relations. The briefing closed as it began with a tone of confidence in Beijing's strategy and a call for cooperative engagement from others. The spokesman's final forceful assurance on China's ties to Lakes encapsulated that posture. Regardless of how global politics evolve, China intends to remain a long-term partner, one that combines economic incentives with an insistence on core political principles. This press briefing, with its blend of policy detail and categorical statements, offers a snapshot of how Beijing is choosing to communicate with the world. Generous on economic commitments, unyielding on sovereignty, and ready to use the full weight of diplomatic rhetoric to shape outcomes in regions from the Western Hemisphere to East Asia.